anything new.
Yeah, listeners, this is a text that you could easily skim if you were taking it out for like an essay or like a thesis. You could easily read like the first couple paragraphs, skim, and then hit the last couple paragraphs in each chapter and probably not miss much unless you really want to get into the nitty gritty stuff, which, hey, this is a book podcast, so we want to do that, so go for it if that's you. The,
Except this time.
yeah. Well, if we did it with this one, dude, it would be like a 7 hour fucking podcast. And
It'd be impossible.
yeah, we're just chatting. But the last thing I wanted to hit in chapter one before we move to the lyric is genre, chapter two, he talks about the spiritual dimension. So he says, lyrics seek, and this is at the end of the page 38, last bit of the big paragraph. It says, lyrics seek to remake the universe as a world, giving a spiritual dimension to matter. This aspect of lyrics should not be neglected, since it often provides the motive for readers finding lyric words memorable and letting them inform experience. That I found very interesting. And I think he doesn't go into that enough towards the end of this. I was expecting him to come back around to this spiritual because he kind of lays down in this first chapter each section he's going to hit, And that's why we're spending so much time on the first chapter, listeners. But it's like, I just, and I kind of, I don't like the word spiritual, but at the same time, I understand what he's getting at, right? Like, there is this, we talked about this a little bit with Lerner. Like, there's an inherent kind of reverence to poetry, and maybe that comes out of because of like the religious context of it, the celebration context, maybe that's why, but like there's this inherent thing that we all just kind of associate with it. And then, when you read something and it gives you this warm feeling, this good feeling, this, whatever you're getting out of it, your pleasure or even joy, as Culler would call it, like, what do we call that, right? Like, other than spiritual, like, it's instinctual to call that some type of spiritual thing, because it's like we can't grab onto it, we can't hold it, like, we can't like point to it and be like, hey, look at this here and measure it, like. And it is a very important aspect to this type of art, really all art, but in poetry. And I just, yeah, what do you think of that? I don't know.
I think it's like a really, I think it's almost vague,
It is, yeah, it is, yeah.
and hard to even say anything about. But when you're talking about like the spiritual, giving a spiritual dimension to matter,
Right, yeah, yeah.
right? I mean, he comes out of talking about, I had to look back at this, um, talking about how like, lyric poets might invest a lot of meaning into like single objects or moments
Yeah.
or places.
Or
Um,
like you said, if the lyric is an event, right, in itself, well, it's a spiritual event. You think back to the romantics that make it maybe a little obvious for readers, where, you just a poem about a tree or something like that, right? Like, it's a spiritual, they're not talking about the tree, they're talking about the connection
yeah,
that living things have to the tree or whatever it is, if it's even that.
I think it's such a hard thing to talk about.
Well, it
Like
is,
I
yeah.
mean, it's the one thing that poets I think most want to talk about too.
Well, because it does hold a lot of, especially when we get to lyrics. So we're not trying to make logical sense of a narrative. We're not trying to make sense of a character in our heads. It's something else,
Well,
like
and this
it's,
is
yeah, like
why I
it's,
think that there is such a fascination with the uh, poem about poems,
well,
poem
that,
about
that too.
poetry.
Yeah. He mentions that. Yeah. At some point, the lyrics tend to be about poetry writing sometimes, right? Now we
Very
could get,
often.
yeah, we could get very scientific about it if we wanted to. Like, we don't understand this necessarily, but most writers know that, right? Like, we don't exactly know where it comes from in our head, but it comes out of our head, right? At some point, like, and this complicates things. But I just giving that spiritual dimension, that kind of intangible thing that we can feel, but we can't see it or touch it, and we like. I'm just I think that's incredibly fascinating. I wish he would go into it more, but like Sophie said, I kind of understand because it's so hard to make like an academic style argument about.
It's what I think um, Merwin refers to as, I think he's quoting Emerson, but what Merwin refers to as wildness.
Wildness.
The
Yeah.
thing, like a sense of something just got away, that something just gets away from you.
Yeah, and like he said, it shouldn't be neglected or just dismissed either. And I think this is also what could lead to a danger because it can lead us to romanticize this beyond what it is.
Well, because I think it's inherently kind of romantic.
Yeah,
It
it
is.
is. Yeah.